So the Spanish arrived in Mexico in 1519 and in Peru in 1532, benefiting in both cases from total chaos due to disease. And after conquering the Inca and the Aztecs, they created an empire with two administrative divisions: the Viceroyalty of New Spain, founded in 1521, and the Viceroyalty of Peru, founded in 1542. In some ways, the Aztec and Inca empires were perfect for Spanish conquest. Their administrative structures were similar, there was a similar link between secular and religious power, albeit different religions, all of which made it relatively easy for the Spanish crown to step into the void left by those two great empires and send their own administrators to run the place. While most of the Spanish aristocrats who came over ran large agricultural operations, you don't see a lot of movies called like Indiana Jones and the Search for a Nice Farm in the Countryside. The real glory for conquistadors was gold. Initially, they found some both in the Caribbean and in Mexico, but never enough to get like super rich. Fortunately, or as I will argue unfortunately, they did find a mountain made of silver. So the Spanish adopted the mita, which the Incas had used to build roads and public buildings, to mine and process that silver. So 1/7 of the adult male Indian population from each district was required to work in the silver mines for a year, being paid only subsistence wages. Now you might wonder why the Spanish didn't purchase African slaves to work in the mines. They did in Mexico, but in South America it was cheaper to use indigenous labor. Purchasing slaves was inefficient because 1, they didn't have experience working at high altitudes, and 2, mine work was super deadly. Mercury, which can be used to refine silver ore, was found at the mountain of Huancavelica, and mercury poisoning among miners was so common that parents would often maim their children to keep them from having to work in the mines.
You can see why I'm struggling to be festive.
Let's go to the thought bubble. So Spanish mines in the Americas produced over 150,000 tons of silver between the 16th and the 18th centuries, over 80% of the world's supply. Spain became the richest nation in Europe, and Spanish silver pesos became the de facto currency. But the Spanish royal family does not appear to have understood inflation, and the huge influx of silver caused skyrocketing inflation, and since they never set tax rates to account for it, they collected the same amount of money 60 years after the discovery of silver, but that money was worth a fraction of what it once had been. And in general, it's not clear that Spain benefited much from the discovery of silver. Rich countries have a way of finding their way into expensive and not totally necessary wars, and Spain was no exception. While empire wasn't the central cause of Spain's many 16th century wars, it sure did fund them. So in 1519, which was a heck of a year for Spain, Charles V united the kingdoms of Spain and Austria by being named head of the Holy Roman Empire, so called because it was not holy, not Roman, and not an empire. Charles had this dream of a unified Central Europe, which was constantly being thwarted by German nobles who had a dream of a non-unified Central Europe, and eventually Charles V's ambitions were shattered, and he gave the Austrian half of his kingdom to his son Ferdinand, and gave Spain, with the American stuff, to Philip in 1556. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Philip II didn't only inherit all of Spain's holdings in the Americas and in Europe and in the Philip not a coincidence-ines, he also inherited a rebellion in the Netherlands because the Dutch were like, we're gonna be Protestant. Also, you guys know nothing about economics, which incidentally the Dutch are still saying to the Spanish. And then the English sided with the Dutch, and there was a war featuring a disastrous invasion of England called the Spanish Armada in 1588. England's success against the Spanish, even though it can largely be chalked up to weather, was credited to Queen Elizabeth I. That led to a period of wealth and national pride, which meant that people had both the money and the desire to see, I don't know, plays about old English kings named Richard. And that, my friends, is how the discovery of silver in Bolivia contributed to the genius of William Shakespeare. Anyway, American silver didn't cause these wars any more than it wrote Hamlet, but the new wealth made both more possible. Knowing that they had this enormous silver war chest at their disposal made them much more inclined to build all those ships that got sunk in 1588. And soon enough, even a mountain of silver couldn't pay for all their warring, and the Spanish crown had to borrow money, which they couldn't pay back, so they defaulted on their debts several times in the 17th century.